Hey guys, tonight we're traveling somewhere truly extraordinary, ancient Egypt. So before we begin, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, grab a blanket and settle in. And if you enjoy these sleepy history journeys, consider subscribing. Also, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating seeing people from all over the world slowly falling asleep together while learning about history. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Nile River at sunrise. Golden light spreads across calm water while palm trees sway gently in the morning breeze. Birds glide low over the river, farmers begin walking toward the fields, and priests whisper morning prayers inside distant temples. Rising above everything are massive monuments of stone, columns, statues, temples, and pyramids, built by a civilization so ancient that even Cleopatra lived closer to our time than to the builders of the Great Pyramid. And at the center of this extraordinary world is you. You are Pharaoh. At first, that sounds amazing. You are the ruler of one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. People bow when you enter a room, priests call you divine, armies obey your commands, and gold flows into your treasury. Servants attend to your needs, you wear jewelry worth entire villages, and your palace is filled with luxury beyond imagination. Honestly, this sounds less like a job and more like winning history's greatest lottery. Unfortunately, ancient Egypt had a small catch. Actually, several catches. Being Pharaoh did not simply mean being king, it meant being far more than a king. You were expected to be a ruler, a military commander, a high priest, a judge, a diplomat, a builder, and a living god. Somehow, on top of all that, you were also expected to help keep the universe functioning properly, which is a slightly unreasonable job description for one human being. Ancient Egyptians believed deeply in something called Ma'at, a concept representing cosmic order, truth, balance, justice, and harmony. When the Nile flooded at the right time, that was Ma'at. When crops grew well, that was Ma'at. When society remained stable, that was Ma'at. Even the sun rising each morning was connected to cosmic order. And the uncomfortable part is that maintaining this balance was considered one of Pharaoh's sacred responsibilities. This created a rather stressful situation. If the Nile flooded too weakly and crops suffered, people did not simply blame weather patterns or natural variation. They might start asking whether Pharaoh had somehow failed in his duties to the gods. If disease spread through villages, whispers could begin that perhaps divine favor had weakened. If enemies attacked the borders, some might wonder whether the gods were displeased with their ruler. Suddenly, your royal job starts sounding ridiculous because you are effectively being blamed for events far beyond human control. Imagine a modern president being blamed because the sun forgot to rise one morning. That gives you a rough idea of the pressure. Every success strengthened your divine image, but every disaster threatened it. Nature was unpredictable, politics were messy, and human beings have always been dramatic. Yet everyone expected perfection. No wonder being Pharaoh was exhausting. Let's talk about your morning routine, because this is where things become especially interesting. You might imagine Pharaoh waking up whenever he wants, stretching lazily in luxury, eating grapes while servants fan him, and admiring himself in polished bronze mirrors. The reality was much less relaxing. Your day started early, often before much of Egypt had even awakened. Servants entered your chambers quietly, while priests prepared sacred rituals and attendants organized royal garments. Even getting dressed was a serious affair. Ancient Egyptian royal clothing was beautiful, but also highly symbolic. Linen garments, ceremonial collars, gold jewelry, crowns, arm rings, sandals, perfume oils, and sacred symbols all carried meaning. You were not simply wearing clothes. You were wearing power, divine legitimacy, and carefully designed political messaging. Ancient Egypt understood branding surprisingly well. Before appearing publicly, ritual purification often took place. Priests chanted prayers, sacred offerings were prepared, and specific routines reinforced your connection to divine authority. Religion was never optional for a pharaoh. Ancient Egypt was deeply religious, and gods like Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Amun shaped nearly every aspect of life. As pharaoh, you stood between gods and humanity, which meant maintaining sacred relationships constantly. Eventually, breakfast arrived, probably including bread, fruit, and beer. Yes, beer. Ancient Egyptians consumed enormous amounts of it, though it was often weaker and more nutritious than modern beer. Starting the morning with bread and beer sounds surprisingly enjoyable. Unfortunately, the peaceful part of the day ended quickly, because soon the officials arrived. And officials always brought problems. Tax reports, construction updates, military news, temple requests, trade matters, noble disputes, border tensions, grain storage concerns, labor shortages, and administrative headaches all found their way to you. Ancient Egypt was vast, and managing it required an enormous bureaucracy filled with scribes. Scribes were among the most important people in the kingdom because they recorded taxes, inventories, labor schedules, trade goods, legal disputes, temple donations, and construction logistics. If something important happened, chances are a scribe wrote it down. Still, bureaucracy creates stress in every era, even in 1300 BCE. Imagine a modern government meeting. Remove the air conditioning, replace business suits with linen garments, add incense everywhere, and include the expectation that one participant is literally divine. Congratulations, you are now in a pharaoh meeting. One official bows deeply and reports that grain production in Upper Egypt is lower this season. Another explains that the Temple of Amun requests additional offerings, which means higher expenses. Another mentions that workers building the royal tomb need more supplies. Another announces foreign envoys waiting for an audience. The problems keep coming, and they never truly stop. The difficult part is that you cannot appear tired, weak, uncertain, or overwhelmed. You are Pharaoh. You are divine. Divine beings are not supposed to panic, even internally, while 12 officials bring 12 major problems before lunch. This leads to one of the strangest realities of being Pharaoh. You are constantly surrounded by people, yet genuine trust becomes rare. Everyone smiles, everyone bows, and everyone praises your wisdom, which sounds pleasant, until you realize many of them want something. Power, influence, wealth, favor, access, prestige, political advantage. Human nature has changed surprisingly little in the last 3,000 years. Court politics existed everywhere, and Egypt was no exception. Nobles competed for influence, priests accumulated power, military leaders gained prestige, and royal family members could become especially complicated. Brothers, sons, wives, secondary wives, heirs, half-heirs, ambitious relatives, everyone close to power carried potential danger. History repeatedly shows that some of the greatest threats to rulers came not from foreign enemies, but from people inside their own palace. Sometimes the most dangerous person in Egypt might be someone smiling politely at dinner. Then there is succession, which creates an entirely different level of stress. You need a strong heir, preferably more than one, because unclear succession can trigger chaos, and chaos threatens Ma'at. Everything always returns to Ma'at. If you die without stable succession, power struggles begin. Nobles choose sides, priests influence outcomes, military leaders calculate opportunities, and suddenly the kingdom risks instability. Unfortunately, having children does not guarantee peace. Sometimes sons fight each other. Sometimes half-brothers compete. Sometimes queens become politically powerful. Sometimes rival claimants emerge with suspiciously convenient royal ancestry. Ancient Egypt experienced more than enough succession crises to prove that producing heirs solved some problems while creating entirely new ones. And then there is the military. Being pharaoh also meant being seen as a commander, even if generals handled much of the battlefield strategy. Victories strengthened your reputation, and defeats weakened it. Neighboring powers such as the Nubians, Libyans, Hittites, and later the Sea Peoples posed genuine threats. Borders needed defense, trade routes required protection, rebellions demanded suppression, and military readiness always mattered. If war broke out, your image became especially important. Royal inscriptions loved depicting Pharaoh as an unstoppable warrior, personally crushing enemies with impossible levels of athletic heroism. Ancient Egyptian art often portrayed rulers as larger than life, literally and symbolically. A pharaoh might be shown defeating dozens of enemies alone, muscles perfect, posture flawless, chariot unstoppable. Reality was likely more complicated, but image mattered as much as action. Ancient rulers understood propaganda extremely well, and Egyptian pharaohs mastered it through monuments, statues, carvings, obelisks, temples, and inscriptions that all communicated the same message. Pharaoh is powerful, Pharaoh is chosen, and Pharaoh brings order. That image had to remain strong constantly, even when you were exhausted, sick, politically pressured, or mentally drained. And ceremonies made this even harder. Ancient Egypt absolutely loved ceremonies. Religious festivals, temple processions, royal appearances, offerings, seasonal rituals, foreign audiences, coronations, funerary rites, and victory celebrations filled the calendar. Every movement had symbolic meaning. Where you stood mattered. What you wore mattered. Who approached first mattered. What offering was presented mattered. At some point, you might suspect even the furniture had ceremonial responsibilities. Honestly, it probably did. These ceremonies reinforced sacred authority. People needed to see strength, stability, and divine order. So you smiled, stood, blessed, posed, walked slowly, and looked majestic for hours. One important rule remained clear: do not trip. Nothing destroys divine aura faster than stumbling over ceremonial robes in front of foreign diplomats. And while all this happened, everyone watched you. Priests watched, officials watched, servants watched, visitors watched, guards watched, artists watched, and scribes watched. You were never truly off stage. That may have been the most exhausting part of all. Privacy became extremely rare. Even inside the palace, servants moved constantly, guards remained nearby. Attendants handled daily tasks, and messengers arrived throughout the day. Palace life sounds luxurious, and it absolutely was. But it was also a cage, a beautiful golden cage. You possessed wealth, power, luxury, and influence. But freedom was far more limited than people imagine. You could not casually walk through a village alone, wander markets freely, or disappear for quiet personal time. You were no longer simply a person. You had become an institution, a sacred office, a living symbol. Symbols do not get much alone time. And if all that were not enough, Pharaoh also had to think about something most people avoid thinking about: death. Ancient Egyptians cared deeply about the afterlife. Death was not seen as a simple ending, but as transition and continuation. For Pharaoh, preparation for death was one of the largest projects of life. Tombs, burial chambers, treasures, sacred texts, statues, offerings, protective rituals, architectural planning, and enormous labor forces all became part of securing your eternal journey. In other words, while running an empire, managing politics, handling religion, maintaining military strength, and preserving cosmic order, you were also expected to supervise the construction of your own incredibly expensive afterlife mansion. Normal responsibilities, really. Some rulers built pyramids. Later rulers constructed elaborate tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Every detail mattered because your soul's journey depended on proper preparation. That alone would keep most people awake at night. And speaking of night, darkness brought yet another strange responsibility. According to Egyptian belief, the sun god Ra traveled through the underworld every night, facing chaos, darkness, and terrifying enemies, most famously the serpent Apophis, embodiment of disorder and cosmic destruction. Every night, a sacred battle repeated. Every dawn represented victory. The sun rose again, and order survived. And once again, your sacred role as Pharaoh connected you to that cosmic struggle. Apparently, ruling Earth was not enough. You also had indirect responsibilities involving celestial anti-serpent operations. Sleep well, or at least try to, because in part 2 we'll enter the palace at night, explore assassination fears, tomb obsession curses, and why even sleeping as Pharaoh was never truly peaceful. By the time the sun disappeared behind the western desert and the golden light over the Nile slowly faded into darkness, most people in Egypt could finally return home, eat dinner, and prepare for sleep. Farmers rested after long hours in the fields, scribes finished their records, craftsmen put away their tools, and temple workers completed evening rituals. For ordinary people, night often meant rest. For Pharaoh, however, night did not always bring peace. At first, the palace seemed calm after sunset. Torches burned softly along stone corridors, servants lowered their voices, and cool desert air drifted through open windows. The palace looked peaceful, almost magical, as shadows danced across carved walls and golden decorations reflected firelight. From a distance, this might seem like the perfect environment for relaxation. Unfortunately, appearances could be deceiving. Even at night, Pharaoh rarely escaped responsibility. Reports could still arrive from distant regions, messengers could bring urgent military news, and palace officials might request immediate decisions on important matters. A border conflict did not pause simply because the sun had set. Political problems did not politely wait until morning. If anything, nighttime often made uncertainty feel heavier. And then there was the problem of trust. Earlier, we talked about how difficult it was to know who truly supported you, but this problem became even more unsettling at night. During the day, danger was visible. You could observe people, read expressions, and watch how court factions behaved. At night, danger became quieter, hidden, less obvious, and often more frightening. Ancient Egypt was powerful, wealthy, and stable for long periods, but that did not mean palace conspiracies never happened. Ambitious nobles existed, rival claimants existed, disloyal officials existed. History repeatedly reminds us that power attracts both loyalty and betrayal, sometimes from the exact same people. Imagine trying to sleep while knowing that your title makes you the most important person in the kingdom, but also potentially the biggest target. That would make restful sleep somewhat difficult. Assassination fears were not always constant, but they were never impossible either. A rival family might gain influence. A trusted official might secretly serve another faction. Even members of the royal household could become politically dangerous. The closer someone stood to power, the greater the opportunities for ambition. This created an exhausting mental burden. Every alliance required caution. Every friendship required evaluation. Every compliment raised questions. Was this genuine respect or carefully disguised ambition? When someone praised your wisdom a little too enthusiastically, suspicion became natural. And family did not necessarily make things easier. Modern families already have enough drama without involving thrones, divine kingship, and succession disputes. Now imagine a royal family where inheritance determines the future of an empire. Suddenly, ordinary family tension becomes something much larger. Brothers become rivals, sons become potential threats, wives gain political influence, mothers protect their children's interests. Everyone begins thinking several steps ahead. Ancient Egyptian royal households could become extremely complicated, especially when Pharaoh had multiple wives or many children. In theory, more children increased succession security. In practice, more children often created more competition. The question of who would inherit power could quietly shape relationships for years. And then there were the queens. Some queens remained largely ceremonial, but others became extraordinarily influential. Figures like Hatshepsut proved that royal women could wield immense political power. In some cases, queens acted as regents, advisors, or even rulers in their own right. This added another layer to palace politics because influence did not always follow simple rules. While trying to manage all these relationships, Pharaoh also had to think constantly about legacy. Not just tomorrow's decisions, but decisions affecting decades or even centuries. Ancient rulers were deeply aware that history would remember them. The question was how. Would you be remembered as a great builder, a conqueror, a protector of Egypt, a favored ruler of the gods? Or would future generations remember weakness, instability, and decline? That pressure alone could keep anyone awake. This helps explain why pharaohs invested so heavily in monuments. Temples, statues, obelisks, and inscriptions were not merely decorative. They were messages to the future. They declared power, success, divine favor, and permanence. Every monument effectively said the same thing. This ruler mattered, this ruler brought order, and this ruler deserves to be remembered. Of course, monuments also required enormous resources. Building on a massive scale meant organizing workers, architects, engineers, stone transport, food supplies, schedules, and logistics across huge distances. Even if Pharaoh did not personally manage every detail, major projects still demanded oversight. And the bigger the project, the greater the pressure to succeed. Now let's talk about something ancient Egyptians thought about far more than modern people usually do: death. Egyptian civilization developed one of history's most elaborate views of the afterlife. Death was not seen as disappearance, but as transformation. The soul continued, but only if proper preparations were made. This belief shaped nearly everything about royal burial traditions. For Pharaoh, this meant death preparation started long before death itself. That sounds strange to modern ears, but in ancient Egypt it made perfect sense. Tomb construction, funerary planning, sacred texts, protective rituals, and burial treasures all had to be arranged carefully. Every object placed in the tomb had purpose. Every wall carving mattered. Every inscription carried spiritual importance. You were essentially managing the world's most expensive retirement plan, except retirement meant eternity, and eternity required planning. Some pharaohs commissioned enormous tombs filled with furniture, jewelry, food offerings, statues, ceremonial weapons, sacred amulets, and symbolic treasures. These were not random luxuries. Egyptians believed many of these objects could serve the ruler in the afterlife. Comfort in eternity depended partly on preparation in life. That meant one uncomfortable reality. While still alive and ruling Egypt, Pharaoh constantly prepared for death. Not exactly cheerful bedtime thinking, and yet death itself was not the only cosmic concern. Night brought another spiritual challenge tied to one of the most important Egyptian myths. Every evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Egyptians believed the sun god Ra began his journey through the underworld. This nightly voyage was not peaceful. It involved darkness, danger, and chaos. Most terrifying of all was Ra's enemy, Apophis, the giant serpent representing destruction and disorder. Apophis was not simply a monster. He symbolized chaos itself, the opposite of Ma'at. If Ma'at represented order, balance, and harmony, Apophis represented collapse, confusion, and cosmic disaster. Every night Ra faced this enemy. Every dawn meant victory. This myth carried enormous symbolic importance because it reinforced a central Egyptian belief: order must constantly defeat chaos. Stability was never permanent. It required protection again and again. And once more, Pharaoh's sacred role connected directly to this struggle. As guardian of Mayat, Pharaoh symbolically supported the triumph of order over chaos. This meant your job description somehow included earthly governance, political management, military oversight, religious leadership, and indirect participation in cosmic anti-serpent operations. That is a truly unreasonable amount of responsibility for one human. So when people imagine Pharaoh sleeping peacefully on luxurious beds surrounded by gold and perfume, they often miss something important. Luxury does not automatically create peace. A golden room cannot silence anxiety. Expensive jewelry cannot remove responsibility. Power can provide comfort, but it can also create immense psychological weight. And Pharaoh carried more weight than almost anyone, because tomorrow morning the sun would rise again. Ceremonies would continue, officials would arrive with fresh problems, temples would demand offerings, nobles would seek influence, and the entire empire would once again expect you to embody perfect divine stability. No pressure. And in part 3, we'll explore one of the most stressful responsibilities of all: producing heirs, succession crises, and why Pharaoh's own children could become some of the most dangerous people in Egypt. By now, you have survived endless ceremonies, overwhelming religious responsibilities, political rivalries, and the constant pressure of maintaining cosmic order. At this point, you might reasonably assume the worst is over. Unfortunately, ancient Egypt has another delightful surprise waiting for you, and it comes from a place that should feel comforting, but often was not. Your own family, more specifically, your children. At first, producing heirs sounds like good news. Every kingdom needs succession, and ancient Egypt was no different. The empire needed stability, and stability depended heavily on the question of who would rule after you. The ideal situation seemed simple enough. You produce a healthy son, raise him to rule, train him carefully, and eventually pass power peacefully to the next generation. History, unfortunately, rarely cooperated with ideal situations. The moment a royal child was born, palace politics became more complicated. Nobles started paying attention, priests formed opinions, advisors began calculating possibilities, and royal family members quietly considered what the child's existence meant for their own future. A baby in the palace was never just a baby. A baby could become the future ruler of Egypt, and that made everyone interested. No pressure for the child, of course. Ancient Egyptian succession did not always follow strict firstborn rules the way modern people often imagine. Yes, the eldest son frequently had advantages, but inheritance could become far more complicated. Pharaoh might have multiple wives. Some wives held higher status than others. Some children had stronger political backing. Some princes gained support from priests, while others built stronger military relationships. Suddenly, succession becomes less about simple family order and more about influence. Imagine having several sons growing up inside the palace. In theory, they are brothers. In reality, each one represents a possible future. Each prince attracts supporters. Each prince becomes a focal point for alliances. Each prince's mother naturally wants the best for her child. That sounds harmless until the best means ruling the most powerful kingdom in the region. This is where family dinners probably became uncomfortable. You might have one son favored by military leaders because he appears strong and confident. Another might gain support from temple priests because he seems deeply religious. A third might be younger but backed by an influential queen. Suddenly, your children are not just family members, they are political assets, political threats, and potential rivals all at once. And that creates stress, unlike almost anything else. Because unlike foreign enemies, you love these people. Or at least, ideally, you do. They are your blood. They carry your legacy. You want them safe. But the system surrounding them constantly pushes competition. Even if your children personally care for one another, The people around them may not. Royal succession across history repeatedly proves one painful truth. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a ruler can leave behind is uncertainty. Royal succession across history repeatedly proves one painful truth. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a ruler can leave behind is uncertainty. Ancient Egypt experienced its share of succession crises. Some transitions were smooth and orderly. Others were not. When succession became unclear, chaos could spread quickly. Rival factions formed, power struggles intensified, legitimacy became debated. And once legitimacy becomes uncertain, the entire kingdom can feel unstable. Remember Ma'at? Yes, we're back to Ma'at again. Succession crises were terrifying partly because they threatened cosmic order itself. A stable transfer of power reinforced balance. A messy transfer suggested disorder. And disorder was exactly what Egyptian civilization feared most. Political instability was not viewed merely as inconvenient, it could feel spiritually dangerous. That pressure placed enormous weight on Pharaoh's role as a father. You were not simply raising children, you were raising possible rulers, future divine kings, guardians of Ma'at, and potential inheritors of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. Even childhood inside the palace reflected this reality. Princes received elite education. They learned administration, religion, warfare, diplomacy, and court behavior. They were trained not merely to live comfortably, but to rule. And while sons often received the most attention in succession discussions, daughters could also become extremely important. Royal daughters strengthened alliances through marriage, enhanced legitimacy, and sometimes became central figures in power transitions. In certain periods, royal bloodline through women carried major political significance. Marriage itself could become a strategic tool, especially within the royal household. This brings us to one of ancient Egypt's most unusual traditions. Royal marriages could become complicated. Very complicated. To preserve divine bloodlines and strengthen legitimacy, some pharaohs married close relatives, including sisters or half-sisters. To modern audiences, this feels deeply strange and uncomfortable. To ancient royal ideology, however, it reinforced sacred kingship. The gods themselves were often portrayed as divine family units, so royal families sometimes mirrored those relationships. Politically, this helped preserve dynastic legitimacy. Practically, it created a family tree that sometimes looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. Imagine trying to explain that to a palace scribe. Even with careful planning, succession remained uncertain because life itself was uncertain. Disease existed, accidents happened, children died young. Promising heirs sometimes never reached adulthood. This meant Pharaoh constantly lived with uncertainty about the future. And future uncertainty creates present anxiety. Suppose you spend years preparing your eldest son to rule. He learns statecraft, earns respect, and appears ready. Then he dies unexpectedly. Suddenly, years of planning collapse. Now another heir must be prepared, alliances shift, and palace factions begin recalculating everything. This happened more often than people realize. Even famous pharaohs faced these problems. Tutankhamun, for example, became ruler at a remarkably young age, partly because of the instability surrounding succession during the Amarna period. That entire era became one of the strangest and most turbulent chapters in Egyptian history. And speaking of strange rulers, we need to talk about one pharaoh who made everything much more complicated. Akhenaten. If most pharaohs tried to preserve tradition, Akhenaten did almost the opposite. He radically changed Egyptian religion by elevating Aten, the sun disk, above traditional gods. Temples changed. Priestly power shifted. Religious traditions that had lasted for centuries were disrupted. This was not a small adjustment. This was a massive spiritual and political shock. Naturally, many people were not thrilled. Why does this matter for succession? because when rulers radically change systems, the next generation inherits instability. Akhenaten's decisions created enormous uncertainty, and after his reign, Egypt struggled to restore traditional order. That meant whoever followed him inherited not only a throne, but also a deeply complicated political mess. Sometimes pharaohs pass down glory. Sometimes they pass down problems. And here lies one of the cruelest ironies of kingship. You spend your life trying to secure the future, yet much of that future remains beyond your control. You build monuments, train heirs, strengthen institutions, and maintain order. But once time moves forward, your control fades. Your children make their own choices. Advisors influence them, priests guide them, rivals challenge them. Eventually, the kingdom belongs to someone else. That realization can be deeply unsettling, because Pharaoh's identity was tied not only to personal power, but also to continuity. You were part of a chain stretching back through countless rulers. You inherited greatness and were expected to pass it onward stronger than before. Failure carried enormous emotional weight, and succession problems were only one source of stress involving children. Sometimes heirs themselves became threats while you were still alive. Yes, this gets awkward. A popular prince could gain support too quickly. Military leaders might admire him, nobles might prefer him, priests might quietly back him. If enough powerful people started viewing the prince as the future, it could subtly weaken the authority of the current pharaoh. No ruler enjoys feeling replaced before retirement. Even if no rebellion occurred, shifting loyalty created tension. People naturally invest in the future. That means some court members may quietly prioritize relationships with heirs. They smile at you today while planning for tomorrow. Again, trust becomes difficult. And that may be one of the most exhausting themes of Pharaoh's life. Uncertainty everywhere. Uncertainty in nature. Uncertainty in politics. Uncertainty in religion. Uncertainty in family. Uncertainty in legacy. From the outside, Pharaoh appears untouchable, golden, powerful, divine, immortal in image. From the inside, the reality is far more human. Stress, fear, responsibility, love, doubt, and exhaustion all exist beneath the crown. The crown shines beautifully. It also weighs heavily. And in part 4, we'll enter one of the most fascinating and eerie parts of Pharaoh's life: tomb building, mummification, curses, and the strange reality of preparing your body for eternity while still alive. By now, you have survived ceremonies, court politics, military pressure, succession anxiety, and the exhausting responsibility of maintaining cosmic order. At this point, you might think you understand the hardest parts of being pharaoh. Unfortunately, ancient Egypt still has one final challenge waiting for you, and in many ways, it may be the strangest challenge of all. You must spend a significant part of your life preparing for your own death. Modern people generally avoid thinking about death unless absolutely necessary. Ancient Egyptians did almost the opposite. They thought about death constantly, not because they were obsessed with endings, but because they believed death was not truly an ending at all. To them, death was transition. It was movement from one state of existence to another. Life on Earth was important, but eternity mattered even more. This belief shaped nearly everything in Egyptian civilization, and for Pharaoh, it carried extraordinary weight. Ordinary people hoped for a peaceful afterlife, but Pharaoh's afterlife had cosmic significance. You were not simply another soul entering the next world. You were a divine ruler expected to continue existing in sacred form. That meant your journey into eternity required planning on a scale most people can barely imagine. And the planning started while you were still very much alive. That means while you were ruling an empire, managing nobles, handling priests, preparing heirs, organizing ceremonies, and trying not to lose your mind from constant responsibility, you were also supervising one of the largest construction projects of your life, your tomb. Yes, your future grave might become one of your biggest long-term projects. At first, This sounds slightly unsettling. Imagine being in your 30s or 40s, relatively healthy, and regularly attending meetings about your burial chamber. Architects discuss stone placement. Priests discuss sacred inscriptions. Officials review labor needs. Artists design wall paintings showing your journey through the afterlife. Everyone behaves as though this is completely normal. In ancient Egypt, it was. Royal tombs were not simple burial places. They were carefully designed spiritual machines meant to protect Pharaoh's body and guide the soul into eternity. Every wall, every chamber, every corridor, and every symbol had purpose. Nothing important was random. The Egyptians believed the soul consisted of multiple spiritual aspects, including the Ka and the Ba. These concepts are difficult to translate perfectly into modern terms, but both were essential parts of the self. For eternal life to continue properly, the body needed preservation, rituals needed completion, and sacred knowledge needed to remain accessible. This is where mummification enters the story. And yes, mummification is every bit as strange and fascinating as people imagine. Ancient Egyptians developed one of history's most famous body preservation techniques because they believed preserving the physical body helped support the soul's journey after death. A damaged or decayed body created spiritual problems. A well-preserved body helped maintain continuity. For Pharaoh, the process was especially elaborate. The body underwent careful preparation by trained specialists. Organs were removed and preserved in canopic jars, each associated with protective deities. The brain was often extracted through the nose, which sounds deeply unpleasant and somehow becomes more unpleasant the longer you think about it. The body was then dried using natron, a natural salt mixture that removed moisture and slowed decomposition. This process took time, a lot of time. The drying stage alone could take weeks. Afterward, the body was carefully wrapped in linen. Protective amulets were placed between layers. Priests performed rituals and recited sacred texts to protect the deceased ruler. Eventually, the mummy was placed inside decorated coffins, often nested within multiple layers of protection, before reaching the sarcophagus itself. That alone sounds like an extraordinary process, but remember something important. As Pharaoh, you know all this while still alive. You know exactly what will happen to your body. You know which rituals matter. You know which prayers will be spoken. You know the details of your future funeral. That is an unusual level of death awareness. And then there were the treasures. Egyptian tombs became famous partly because rulers were buried with astonishing wealth. Gold jewelry, ceremonial weapons, furniture, clothing, statues, food offerings, sacred objects, perfumes, chariots, and luxury items could all be included. These objects were not simply decorative. They were believed to serve practical or symbolic roles in eternity. Your afterlife, ideally, should be comfortable. Very comfortable. Tutankhamun's tomb offers one of the most famous examples. Although he ruled for a relatively short time and died young, the treasures discovered in his tomb stunned the modern world. Golden masks, jewelry, chariots, furniture, and countless ritual objects revealed extraordinary craftsmanship and immense wealth. And Tutankhamun was not even among Egypt's greatest rulers. Imagine the scale of more powerful pharaohs. Of course, all that wealth created a rather obvious problem: tomb robbers. If you fill underground chambers with gold, jewels, and priceless artifacts, eventually someone will notice. Ancient people were just as capable of greed as modern people. Even though tomb robbery carried severe punishment, it remained a major issue throughout Egyptian history. This created another layer of stress for Pharaoh. How do you protect your tomb? How do you protect treasures? How do you ensure your body remains undisturbed for eternity? Pyramids partly solved this through massive scale and intimidating architecture. The Great Pyramid, for example, inspires awe even today. But massive monuments also advertise something quite clearly: Important treasure may be inside. Not ideal. Later rulers shifted toward hidden tombs, particularly in the Valley of the Kings. Instead of giant pyramids visible for miles, tombs were carved into desert cliffs in more concealed locations. The idea was simple: harder to find means harder to rob. Unfortunately, human greed is highly motivated. Many royal tombs were eventually looted anyway. This possibility carried deep spiritual anxiety. Tomb robbery was not merely theft of valuables. It threatened sacred burial integrity. Disturbing the tomb could interfere with afterlife security. To people who believed deeply in these systems, this was horrifying. Which brings us to something modern audiences love discussing: curses. You've probably heard of the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs. Popular culture loves stories about mysterious tomb curses, punishing anyone who disturbs sacred resting places. While Hollywood exaggerated much of this, protective inscriptions absolutely existed. Some tomb warnings were symbolic, invoking divine punishment against intruders. Others warned that disturbing sacred spaces would anger gods or unleash spiritual consequences. These warnings were meant partly as spiritual defense and partly as psychological warfare. And honestly, pretty effective. Even today, the idea of disturbing an ancient royal tomb feels unsettling. But beyond curses and tombs lies something even heavier: the question of legacy. Because eventually every pharaoh faced one terrifying possibility. What if you are forgotten? You built monuments. You performed rituals. You defended borders. You maintained Ma'at. You produced heirs. You preserved cosmic order. And yet time is ruthless. Future rulers may erase your memory. Political enemies may destroy inscriptions. Successors may claim your achievements. History may forget your name. This happened more than once. Ancient Egypt practiced something historians call damnatio memoriae, or destruction of memory, where a ruler's name and images could be deliberately erased. Statues smashed, cartouches carved away, monuments altered, records rewritten. Imagine spending your entire life building eternal legacy only for a future ruler to erase your existence from walls. That is terrifying, and it happened. Hatshepsut is one of the most famous examples. One of Egypt's most remarkable rulers, she governed successfully and oversaw impressive building projects. Yet after her reign, efforts were made to remove traces of her rule from monuments. Why? Politics, power, legacy control. History is often written by survivors, and pharaohs understood this deeply. This means one of the greatest ironies of kingship becomes clear. You may control an empire while alive, but you cannot fully control how the future remembers you. The future belongs to people you will never meet. That realization is humbling and strangely human, because beneath all the gold, divine symbolism, and monumental architecture, Pharaoh remained human. Yes, Egyptians treated Pharaoh as divine, but Pharaoh still felt exhaustion, still felt fear, still faced uncertainty, still dealt with grief, anxiety, loss, family tension, and political stress. The crown did not remove humanity. It simply hid it beneath gold. And perhaps that is the most fascinating truth of all. From the outside, being pharaoh looked like the ultimate dream. You ruled one of history's greatest civilizations. You lived in unimaginable luxury. You commanded armies, built monuments, shaped religion, and influenced millions of lives. People bowed before you. Priests praised you. Artists immortalized you in stone. It sounds like perfection. Until you look closer. The palace was magnificent, but it was also a cage. The crown was beautiful, but it was heavy. Power was immense, but so was pressure. Every flood mattered. Every harvest mattered. Every ceremony mattered. Every heir mattered. Every alliance mattered. Every decision carried consequences. You were expected to be perfect, strong but wise, powerful but just, divine but relatable, fearless but cautious, merciful but decisive. and somehow calm, while an entire civilization believed cosmic balance depended partly on you. No wonder being Pharaoh was exhausting. In many ways, the greatest burden was not war or politics or ceremonies. It was expectation. The constant expectation to embody order in a chaotic world. And maybe that is why ancient Egypt remains so fascinating. Its monuments feel eternal, its statues feel calm and unshakable. Pharaohs appear larger than life, carved in stone with perfect posture and expressionless confidence. But behind those statues were real people. People carrying impossible expectations, people trying to maintain order in a complicated world, people hoping their efforts would outlast them, and somehow, many of them succeeded. Thousands of years later, we still speak their names: Ramses, Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Cleopatra. Empires rose and fell, kingdoms vanished, entire civilizations disappeared. Yet ancient Egypt still captures our imagination like few others. Its temples still inspire awe. Its pyramids still defy belief. Its history still feels almost mythical. And perhaps that is the final irony. Pharaohs spent their lives trying to defeat time, and in some ways, they did. As our journey through ancient Egypt comes to an end, the desert night grows quiet. The Nile reflects silver moonlight, temple fires burn softly in the distance, priests finish their evening prayers, palace corridors fall silent, servants move quietly through shadowed halls. At last, for a brief moment, even Pharaoh can rest. The crown is set aside, the ceremonies are over, the officials have gone, the empire sleeps. Tomorrow, the burdens return, rituals, politics, expectations, responsibilities, and the endless work of preserving order. But tonight, there is silence, there is darkness, there is peace. So the next time you see a golden mask, a towering pyramid, or a stone statue of a ruler staring across eternity, remember this. You are not just looking at wealth or power. You are looking at someone who carried one of the most exhausting jobs in human history, and despite all the gold, glory, and divine status, being Pharaoh was probably not the dream job it appeared to be. It was, however, one of the most extraordinary, and thankfully for us, we can admire it from a safe distance, without having to worry about floods, rival priests, succession crises, or cosmic anti-serpent duties, which, if we're being honest, is a pretty good deal. Now, let the Nile drift quietly through your thoughts. Let the desert wind soften into silence and allow the ancient world to slowly fade into dreams. Good night.